Do you think Margaret Thatcher had girl power?
Yes, of course.
Do you think she effectively utilized girl power by funneling money to illegal paramilitary death squads in Northern Ireland?
Margaret Thatcher was a real... What's a good British insult? Yeah, okay. Margaret Thatcher was a real cockwomble. I had previously made a video on the Ronald Reagan movie and noted that Margaret Thatcher was equally as disgusting. I didn't go much further than that, as I said it would take an entire video to explain, and, well, this is that video. Because Margaret Thatcher's legacy has its own film called The Iron Lady. It was directed by Phyllida Lloyd, who had previously been a director on Mamma Mia and executive producer on Mamma Mia, Here We Go Again.
Yeah.
It also features a cast of notable names, including Jim Broadbent, Olivia Colman, Richard E. Grant, and Meryl Streep as Margaret Thatcher. Meryl Streep, by the way, would win an Academy Award for this role. So we're not exactly dealing with a cheap film like Reagan. But even with better production values and a cast that garnered award praise, The Iron Lady is still only telling half the story about the life of Margaret Thatcher. What it leaves out is very concerning and worth highlighting, as you will see. Also, as you might be able to tell from my accent, I'm not from the UK, so I'd like to pre-apologize for any English anachronisms or little details that I might miss. And I'd also like to apologize if I misuse the insult of cockwomble. The film is framed through flashbacks in Margaret Thatcher's final years when she was stricken with dementia. Through her hazy memory, she recalls her early life as a teenager, her career in politics, and also the ghost of her dead husband, Dennis, played by Jim Broadbent. And I immediately hate this framing device. We're not only getting Margaret Thatcher's biography told by Margaret Thatcher, but through an older version that is losing her mind. And I hate this because if there are any criticisms of the history that is shown, you just know somebody's going to jump to the defense of, well, we're seeing these memories from Thatcher's point of view, and she has dementia, so of course these memories are going to be exaggerated and even false at times. And just, no, I'm sorry, I'm not giving the filmmakers this out of the unreliable narrator for what they're about to do here with history. Her recollection begins with her teenage years, where she worked with her father, Alfred Roberts, at their local grocery store. She also listens to his speeches where he preaches sayings like, help each other and not through state handouts. So the conservative roots are already being laid generationally here. For context, Alfred was a liberal who turned to conservatism after coming to despise collectivism. After all, he started as a greengrocer apprentice and became the owner of his own grocery store. And if he could do it, surely everybody could pull themselves up by their bootstraps. He's basically the old school version of conservatives who like to call themselves classical liberals. With some encouragement from Dad, Margaret gets approval to study at Oxford. Now, while Alfred is thrilled about this news, Margaret's mother, Beatrice, isn't as enthused. Thatcher rarely spoke about her mother, considering she's hardly mentioned in her memoirs, but she did paint a portrait of a distant matriarch. Beatrice never engaged in much political discussion, and according to Margaret in a 1961 interview, she wasn't talking much with her daughter past the age of 15. The older Margaret of 2008 watches the Islamabad Marriott Hotel bombing on television and immediately starts having flashbacks of the Brighton Hotel bombing in 1984 by the IRA. This is more of a preview for what will happen later and generates a bit of tension for whether or not Dennis will survive this bombing. And, spoilers, he doesn't die here. As for the Islamabad hotel attack, the film doesn't address much of it beyond someone mentioning it might have been the work of Al-Qaeda. The Al-Qaeda link was suspected for the attack being similar to their usual tactics, but there has been no conclusive proof of their involvement, involving a combination of a gas leak explosion on the top floor and a suicide bomber on the bottom floor. The Taliban, an ally of Al-Qaeda, also denied taking any ownership of these attacks as it did not reflect their goals of political violence. There were other Islamist groups suspected of this terrorist attack, but nothing concrete has been proven about their involvement. Only 3 suspected terrorists were arrested, but they were acquitted due to a lack of evidence. For what was considered one of the worst terrorist attacks in Pakistan, no definitively identified enemy carried out this bombing. The investigation turned up so little that it was suspected that even US Marines and Pakistani politicians had orchestrated the attack. All the attack did was further Pakistan's commitment to joining the United States in its forever war in the war on terror. Because if you can't find out who's committing the terror, You might as well just attack terror as a concept. Getting back to young Margaret, the film skips ahead to her earning her Oxford degree and running for Parliament. At a dinner with her fellow Conservatives, she gives this monologue that essentially repeats her father's political stance. Quote,
"What I do think is that a man should be encouraged to stand on his own 2 feet. Yes, we help people. Of course we help people. But for those that can do, they must just get up and do. And if something's wrong, they shouldn't just whine about it. They should get in there and do something about it. Change things."
Remember the speech for later, specifically the part about helping people and how she says people shouldn't whine about what's wrong. Another aspect to note about this scene is how Margaret is looked down upon for being a woman who grew up working in a grocery store. The film brings up this repeatedly to further stress the pressures that Thatcher faced when entering politics. The heroic narrative being painted here is that Margaret defied the odds as a working woman among wealthy men. She's going to prove that she can be just as ruthless as any conservative out there. Because any hideous thing a conservative man can do, a woman can do just as well. Like, remember when I played that Eric Andre clip earlier about Thatcher and girl power?
Do you think she effectively utilized girl power by funneling money to illegal paramilitary death squads in Northern Ireland?
I don't know about that.
Well, the Iron Lady is literally arguing for that. The older, dementia-ridden Thatcher then gives a different speech at a dinner following the Islamabad hotel attack. Worth noting in her weary words is this passage, quote,
"We have always lived alongside evil, but it has never been so patient, so avid for carnage, so eager to carry innocence along with it into oblivion. Western civilization must root out this evil wherever it hides, or she risks defeat at the hands of global terror in the nuclear age."
It's pretty impressive that even with dementia, Thatcher can still use dog whistles while addressing a terrorist attack and give Western civilization a gender. Girl power.
I don't know about that.
But don't worry about all that girl power because Thatcher hates identity politics. Because directly following the dinner, Thatcher is approached by a young woman inspired by her political career. To this declaration of inspiration, Thatcher responds with, quote,
"Well, it used to be about trying to do something, you see. Now it's about trying to be someone."
Indeed, Thatcher did some things that are pretty bad, so the film is mostly going to fall back on the trails that she blazed. You don't want to say anything that bad about her. I mean, she was still alive when this film was being made. Returning to young Margaret Thatcher, the film skips ahead to her losing her first campaign at Dartford. Following her defeat, the young Dennis proposes to Margaret, highlighting that a married woman has a higher chance of getting elected. Margaret accepts his proposal, but only if Dennis recognizes her autonomy as a politician and not a mere housewife. From the movie, quote,
"Beyond all the cooking and the cleaning and the children, one's life must mean more than that. I cannot die cleaning a teacup."
This is foreshadowing for the end of the film, believe it or not. The marriage proposal following the election is meant to be seen as a romantic moment, but the relationship seemed to be more about political convenience than romance. This is according to biographer John Campbell in his biography Margaret Thatcher, the Grocer's Daughter, and Dennis's own children, specifically Carol Thatcher, as in her biography of her father called Below the Parapet. From her book, quote, "If marriage is either a takeover or a merger, then my parents enjoyed the latter. There was a great deal of common ground and a tacit laissez-faire agreement that they would get on with their own interests and activities." Laissez-faire. Interesting choice of a descriptor. Okay, I know that this is meant to imply more of a refusal to interfere with each other's businesses, but this really makes her marriage sound less like a partnership and more like a treaty. I should probably go into some details about Dennis since the film doesn't. The movie portrays Dennis as this nice guy who, though later stressed by his wife's political ambitions, generally stood back and supported all her efforts with glee. But there's more to him than that. Before marrying Margaret, Dennis was married to Margot Kempson in 1942. He married her during the war, and while Dennis would live to see the end of World War II, his absence led to Margot divorcing him after she fell in love with another man. He refused to speak much about this divorce with his children. Also, the idea that Dennis was going to be on equal ground with Margaret wasn't destined to play out exactly like that. Before marrying Margaret, Dennis had inherited his family business, Atlas Preservatives. He would later sell his company to Castrol in the 1960s to ensure Margaret's financial stability. But it also sounded like Dennis, just wasn't a very good businessman. From Robin Harris's Not for Turning, The Life of Margaret Thatcher, quote, "Throughout his life, and despite his training as an accountant and his eagle-eyed scrutiny of the stock exchange, Dennis was a poor investor. Once his wife had become prime minister, and even after her retirement, it was Dennis who lived off her and not vice versa. He matched Alf Roberts in his dislike of spending his own money. More generally, while he did not raise eyebrows about exploiting his position, he certainly made the most of it. He was a celebrity exclusively because of whom he had married." The film at least doesn't shy away from this aspect of his character, and it's honestly kind of fitting that he's portrayed as this lingering ghost in Margaret's later years. So the past finally reaches the time period where Meryl Streep can step into the role. Having won her position in Parliament in 1959, Margaret heads off to defy the notion that government is a boys' club. If you believe the framing of this movie, it makes it seem as if there were no other women MPs up to this point. And this is false. The first woman to become a member of Parliament was Nancy Astor in 1919. Nancy, however, is even less appealing as a Parliament girl boss because despite having fought for women's rights, she was really big into Nazis, so you couldn't exactly make a flowery movie about her legacy. Wait a minute, did they make a movie? The BBC made a 9-episode miniseries about her? What the fuck? Now, while Nancy's career might have ended in the 1940s, there were other women MPs during Thatcher's political career. In fact, when Thatcher was first in office, there were already many elected women, including Betty Harvey Anderson, Judith Hart, Muriel Gammons, Mevin Pike, Joan Vickers, Patricia McLaughlin, Evelyn Emmett, Joyce Butler, Harriet Slatter, Irene White, Evelyn Hill, and Edith Pitt. Not a single one of these MPs is acknowledged in the film, because hey, why waste the chance to showcase one woman in heels among all the men of a boys' club? The only man who seems to be on her side on her first day is Aerie, and okay, we have to talk about this guy's politics because the film doesn't, and it plays a crucial role in his downfall. Aerie would later take on the job of Shadow Secretary of State for Northern Ireland during a time when things were really not going well there. The devolution in Northern Ireland's government wasn't sticking, and Aerie wasn't helping, mostly because he didn't know what he was doing. Aerie's choice to work on Ireland was seen as baffling given how little he knew about Irish issues. Instead of trying to contain the conflicts that the IRA were having with the British forces, Aerie was all about defeating the Irish paramilitary forces. This is likely why Aerie was targeted by the Irish National Liberation Army, who blew him up with a car bomb in 1979. Now, the film does show the explosion that kills him, but hardly even touches the issues of the Troubles in Ireland. And if you were only going off the film, the Irish come off like a mere terrorist group instead of becoming a complicated issue of British forces taking too much control. But don't think about any of that. The film only wants you to see Aerie as a good friend and the campaign manager of Thatcher, who then got exploded, so that Maggie can have a sad. But I'm skipping ahead here. Back to Parliament. The film skips ahead a bit to her becoming Secretary of State for Education and Science. Her time in the House finds her making the case that she has no choice but to close the schools due to a crippled economy, which she argues was made worse by union strikes. And rather than directly challenging this notion, the House is framed to be making just sexist remarks against her, as though a woman has no place speaking about such issues in a shrill manner. She lobs back a snippy insult, and Margaret is seen as triumphant for stepping up to the men who said that she should go back to the kitchen. Okay, so there's a lot of context missing here, and it's more damning than you think. Thatcher was all about keeping the government funded, and when the economy was sinking, she decided that education should make some cuts in expenditure. Namely, lunch. The lunches that children had to pay for at school were significantly raised in price. Free milk had been provided to school children under the Education Act of 1944, but Thatcher struck it down. And because of the refusal to provide free milk to schools, Thatcher earned her most notable nickname of Margaret Thatcher Milk Snatcher. This public image was so bad that Margaret Thatcher nearly quit politics, but she stayed strong and didn't let the pressures get to her. She knew she was right to snatch that milk and jack up the prices of school lunches, even though it led to declining child health and poor youth diets in the UK that just cascaded over the decades. Now, there were plenty of government problems that plagued the UK during the 1970s. The film does address a few of these aspects, but rarely explores them beyond being background dressing. This is a form of filmmaking that I have decided to call news noise, in which the film highlights the news headlines of the era and then never fully engages with them. So we get plenty of headlines about trade union strikes in the areas of sanitation and power, all of which are blamed on Thatcher's Conservative Party. Margaret also deeply opposes working with coal miners who are demanding a pay increase, but less so out of economic concerns and more because the union was convincing the army to join them in a strike. How rude. The army shouldn't be striking with people who want enough money to pay their bills. Conservatives need the army to break up those protests because there's a whole lot more of that coming down the pike. When the areas of compromise come up, Margaret asks what her father would do, and she has a flashback to one of his speeches where he states, quote, "Napoleon called us a nation of shopkeepers. He meant it as an insult, but to me, it's a compliment. That's why he couldn't beat us. That's why Hitler can't beat us. We conservatives believe in giving people the freedom and opportunity to fulfill their own potential, especially the young. There's no good in pretending we're all equal. We're not all the same, never have been, never will be. We should encourage our children to aspire to achieve more than we have, for our children today will be the leaders of tomorrow." Okay, first off, Napoleon's statement of a nation of shopkeepers has been greatly disputed for such attribution. But more importantly, the quote was meant to highlight that Britain was more focused on commerce than on their military, which was perceived as a compliment long before Margaret's dad held this view. It's a very Peggy Hill opinion. It also doesn't feel like Margaret is living up to her father's words here, because he mentions that Britain should give youth, especially, more opportunities and achieve more than they have. And, how can children do that when their school diets were being reduced under Thatcher's political career? You know, it's a little hard to live up to your full potential when you're starving. The 1970s continue to get worse with energy blackouts. So Margaret decides to run for leader of the party because, in her words, someone must say the unsayable. The unsayable here being, I don't give a shit if you're starving and can't afford your bills. We're raising taxes, poor people. Get fucked. Dennis, at least, has a little bit of a spine, though, because when Margaret tells her husband about this latest political move as a duty, he bites back at her, and he tells her, quote, "Don't call it duty, it's an ambition, and the rest of us, well, we can all go to hell." And yeah, that sums up so much of the conservative movement. But this is seen less as something to be concerned about and more of a hurdle for Thatcher to get over. Because following this scene, we get a meeting with her campaign managers where she holds her ground on wearing her pearls. Because she's going to be a political leader, but she's still going to be a lady. A lady who confessed on television that she loved American philosophy and that the UK could learn so much from America. America's president at the time was Richard Nixon, right in the middle of the Watergate scandal that forced him to resign. I guess the lesson Margaret learned was not to get caught with your hand in the cookie jar. And if you do get caught, don't resign until it's clear that nobody likes you anymore. The film then treats us to a montage of her voice training and campaign stops aimed at appealing to the nation. It's all framed to be equally charming and inspirational. Marvel at Margaret perfecting her speech voice, promoting ice cream vendors, and demonizing unions. But hey, let's not think too much about her political moves that ultimately worsen Britain, because it's time to be sad about Aries' car explosion. Anyway, Margaret wins her campaign for Prime Minister, and we get this triumphant scene of her first entering 10 Downing Street. As she proceeds with the world gawking at Britain's first woman Prime Minister, she quotes St. Francis as the music swells.
"Where there is discord, may we bring harmony. Where there is error, may we bring truth. Where there is doubt, may we bring faith. And where there is despair, may we bring hope.
And where there is free milk, may we snatch and tax the shit out of it." Getting back to Elder Thatcher, she goes to visit the doctor about her dementia, and she tells the doc, quote,
"People don't think anymore. They feel. One of the great problems of our age is that we are governed by people who care more about feelings than they do about thoughts and ideas. Now, thoughts and ideas, that's what interests me."
Ah yes, thoughts don't care about your feelings. That old canard. As for Margaret's thoughts, she keeps hallucinating her dead husband and tries to drown him out with booze and music. Quote,
If I can't hear you, I can't see you. If I can't see you, you're not here. And if you're not here, I'm not going mad.
There's nothing quite like a conservative trying to distract from the reality that they're wrong. The story then cuts to Parliament, where Margaret is getting a tongue lashing from the politicians. Her reign is called out for the highest levels of unemployment since 1934, the biggest fall in total output in steel and coal production in 1 year since 1931, the biggest collapse in industrial production since 1921, and emboldening the rich to get richer while diminishing the middle class. And there's no comfort for her when she leaves the house either. People are furious in the streets about her administration. They call her a monster and that she should get out of office. How rude. What did Margaret do to deserve such hatred, besides all the points previously stated in the last scene? Well, if you really need more ammo, there's plenty of other stuff to hate Thatcher for, which the film thankfully obliges us with. Thatcher's fellow conservatives state that she is growing increasingly out of touch with the country. And to prove that she is not, Thatcher, while being fitted for a decadent dress, proudly states the current price of butter. Great, Margaret. You passed the Lucille Bluth test.
I mean, it's one banana, Michael. What could it cost? $10?
But also, what does this prove? Like, okay, you know how much butter costs, but how much is the average salary, and how much of that salary goes into paying for that butter, and what rate of increase is there in compensation versus inflation? These are all issues that never come up because Margaret never cites them, and her fellow conservatives are too busy mocking her for her background in groceries. Nobody is in the right in this scene. They're all idiot conservatives who don't know what they're doing, all of them thinking more about their careers than who is going to suffer. Thatcher, however, is queen idiot for saying this.
If we don't cut spending, we'll be bankrupt. Yes, the medicine is harsh, but the patient requires it in order to live. Should we withhold the medicine? No, we're not wrong.
Yeah, we're not wrong. Just tighten your belts, work harder, and don't think about things you can't afford, like food, housing, and healthcare services. Don't think about medicine. That analogy is over. It is now 1983, and the protests have gotten worse, especially for coal miners being forced out of work. When addressing these many concerns, Thatcher states, quote,
There are those who would say hold back. There are those who would make us retreat. But we shall never give in to them. We shall never waver, not for a second, in our determination to see this country prosper once again.
For context, the them Margaret is referring to are the trade unions and those who want a wage that they can live on. You can't give in to them. Why, if you give the working class a wage that they can live on, then they'll start demanding some socialism or something. Thatcher's war against the working class resulted in the miners' strike of the mid-1980s. Now, if you were to ask the conservatives, they would likely argue that they were going to shut down these mining pits because they weren't efficient. But in reality, the pits were shut down because they were led by unions. The miners protested for their jobs while the police of these communities acted like thugs. Thatcher needed to paint these miners fighting for their jobs as the enemy, literally calling the union leaders the enemy within, and that meeting union demands would be comparable to surrendering democracy to mob rule. So Thatcher didn't cave, and the protests would stop in 1985, weakening unions and turning entire mining communities into poverty wastelands. So more news noise occurs about protests and the IRA bombings, whatever, no big deal, unless of course the bombings hurt Thatcher. And one does when she and her husband are caught in the Brighton hotel bombing. Thatcher had become a bigger target during this time for increasing hostilities within Ireland, going so far as to entirely ignore the hunger strikes of IRA prisoners, resulting in many deaths due to starvation. Much like her colleague Airy, Thatcher did not know much about Irish politics and thus approached the IRA's violent strife with all the political tact of a child, pretending that nobody really understood Northern Ireland. Because of her ignorance and continuance of hatred, Thatcher was so despised by the IRA that one of their members, Danny Morrison, referred to her as, quote, that unctuous self-righteous fucker. But the self-righteous fucker survived. Next up is Thatcher's handling of the Falklands War in 1982. The Falkland Islands had been a British crown colony until the Argentinian military junta had invaded. They were able to invade because of the neglect of military defenses in that region, which Thatcher herself authorized. So, whoops. Not content to negotiate with terrorists, Thatcher decided to go to war over her budget-cutting error, even though sending in troops would also be too costly. But it didn't matter to Thatcher, though. I mean, this was her Pearl Harbor. This was her chance to showcase how tough she could be during a war. This brought about a 2-month war that led to the deaths of 255 British soldiers. Eventually, the Argentinian forces retreated, and Margaret could declare victory. Her re-election was assured for 1983. Looking back on the event, the ghost of Dennis declares that Margaret went from being the most hated prime minister to the nation's darling. Sure, Dennis, sure, whatever you need to tell yourself. Except wait, this is only a hallucination of Dennis in the mind of Margaret, so of course he'd say something that dumb. Everybody who was poor, working class, and or Irish hated the shit out of Margaret Thatcher. But hey, screw them. Cue an exciting montage of Thatcher's many celebrations set to the tune of the not sensible song, I'm in Love with Margaret Thatcher, in which the majority of the lyrics are, I'm in love with Margaret Thatcher, just repeated over and over. Never has a punk song ever sounded so non-punk. During this montage and music, there are scenes of Thatcher dancing with Ronald Reagan, which is just a lot. I'm sure some conservatives were beating themselves off to this scene. Ronald Reagan is equally as gross as Margaret Thatcher, but it would take a whole other video to explain, which I thankfully already made. Skip ahead to 1989, and Thatcher is pushing for the poll tax. This is where it becomes tough to defend Thatcher's legacy, especially since we're at the tail end of her political career when she was becoming a bigger disgrace. Also known as the community charge, the poll tax would impose a fixed rate on everyone in a community, regardless of income. This policy would only benefit the rich, as the poor were forced to pay way more in taxes. There is no way to spin this as a good idea unless you're a greedy pig, and some of the conservatives knew this. During a cabinet meeting, Thatcher states that her policies may be unpopular, but they are the right policies. The cabinet stresses that it is a bad idea to ask the poor to pay the same tax rate as the rich, and Thatcher's response to that is, why not? The obvious answer is that it's unfair, and to that, Thatcher spits back with one of the most defensive and conservative-brained statements for the poll tax. These are her words from the film.
This is a simple proposition. If you live in this country, you must pay for the privilege. Something, anything. If you pay nothing, you care nothing. What do you care where you throw your rubbish? Your council estate is a mess. Your town graffiti. What do you care? It's not your problem, it's somebody else's problem. It's the government's problem. Your problem, some of you, is that you haven't got the courage for this fight. You haven't had to fight for anything. It's all been given to you, and you feel guilty about it. Well, may I say, on behalf of those who have had to fight their way up and who don't feel guilty about it, we resent those slackers who take and contribute nothing to the community.
She basically throws a temper tantrum about not being able to tax the poor, calls them lazy, and declares that her cabinet is a bunch of pussies for not wanting to be the Legion of Doom that she really wanted. She gets snippy with everybody, including her longest-serving cabinet minister of Joffrey. Realizing that the poll tax was an idiotic decision that was going to tank the party's popularity, Joffrey resigned in 1990, citing Thatcher's dangerous ideas as his reason for leaving. This was one of the signs that Thatcher's political career was over, but the film acknowledges plenty of other factors. Obviously, nobody liked the poll tax. More riots are held in the streets, and there are shots of furious citizens banging on Margaret's car. Not only was the poll tax unpopular, but it was also ineffective. Several residents refused to pay the tax, and given the vast number of those withholding payment, there was no way to arrest everybody or haul them into court. People had good reason to oppose the poll tax, and the music of the era reflected this revolt. Punk rock band The Exploited released a song called Don't Pay the Poll Tax, and there were several compilation albums with titles like A Pox Upon the Poll Tax, Axe the Tax, and Fuck the Poll Tax. And the only way to get rid of the poll tax was to get rid of Thatcher. So conservatives quickly abandoned support of her as new leadership is on the horizon. And yet, Margaret is still delusional about her position. But her bully tactics won't work this time, and we're treated to a nightmare montage of her realizing her lack of support. Margaret's argument against these claims about her being bad for the party is that the people put her in the role of prime minister, and it should be up to the people to tell her when to go. But like, Thatcher, there were plenty of people in the streets telling you to go. Some of them were directly shouting at you to get out of the government. Nobody wants you. Nobody likes you. Your politics are dog shit, and everybody has had enough of your conservative clown show. After some convincing from Dennis, Margaret Thatcher eventually resigns as prime minister. And she leaves in the most theatrical way possible, surrounded by women applauding her and roses at her feet. They all look upon her with great admiration, their eyes saying, "Thank you, Margaret Thatcher, for blazing trails as the first woman to be a prime minister. You left behind a hideous legacy that further stoked division, worsened communities, and cost lives, but hey, a milestone is a milestone. You were the first woman prime minister, and history can't snatch that away in the same way that you snatched away milk from school children." So after finally getting rid of Dennis's things, the ghost of Dennis departs, and the final scene features Margaret washing a teacup, and hey, look at that, she didn't die, see? Her prophecy has come true, and she's succeeded in not dying while washing a teacup. She would instead die 2 years after this movie from a stroke. And then the film just ends there. Like, there's no textual epilogue highlighting Thatcher's accomplishments or inspiring legacy that she left behind. Just bam, credit time. Don't bother looking too much more into her legacy. So yeah, that's the legacy of Margaret Thatcher, presented in the most flowery form possible. And upon her death in 2013, she was spoken of with great admiration by the people that she served.
I'd put a stake through her heart and garlic round her neck to make sure she never come back.
Isn't that a pretty horrible thing to say when her funeral's going on right now?
Too bad, too bad.
But didn't she show that a woman could become Prime Minister? Nobody'd done that before.
Do you want a woman like that that's a warmonger and rips the heart out of a country? Is that what you want for a Prime Minister of any sex?
Sorry, did I say admiration? I meant hatred. Now, for a biopic that covers Thatcher's entire political career, The Iron Lady is surprisingly short, running only about an hour and 45 minutes long. The quick storytelling makes sense, however, considering that the only way to present Thatcher in a positive light is to speedrun through much of her legacy. Just when you think the film is going to address the situation regarding the coal miners' strike, it steers towards the Falklands War. We get glimpses of IRA car bombings, but never address the situation in Ireland beyond these attacks. The film is critical of Thatcher here and there, as with her poll tax being unpopular and unfair, but it rarely sticks to any topic long enough to make a point. Because yes, Thatcher's poll tax was implemented, but when she was outed from office, it was dismantled a few years later for being so stupid. It's tough to make Margaret look good in this film beyond just repeating that she was a tough woman who didn't let anything shake her ambitions. Her ambitions being cruel conservative policies that ultimately doomed her run as prime minister. But hey, she had girl power.
I don't know about that.
Now, unlike the Ronald Reagan movie that I had reviewed previously, The Iron Lady is a more competent film on a technical level. It looks nice, and it features some clever nonlinear editing and boasts some notable performances. Meryl Streep does deliver a great performance, but I mean, she always does. The film even employs a smart tactic to shield its subject from criticism. How could you be mad at the elderly and feeble Margaret Thatcher? She couldn't even snatch milk from children if she tried. Now she has to go to the store, buy a pint, and then bitch to her ghost husband about how much it costs these days. She's an old woman who is so lonely now that her husband is dead and her children don't really visit much. And don't you feel sorry for her in this movie? Well, if you're not familiar with Thatcher's legacy, then the answer would be yes. But if you've read about Thatcher in various published biographies, documentaries, and news articles, the answer should be fuck no. Too much of Thatcher's career involved not caring about people who were suffering in her own country. Many people died because of her irrational decisions to prove how tough of a woman she was. If she didn't feel for anybody who suffered under conservative tactics, why should we feel bad for her in old age? Pay no attention to the hideous conservative legacy behind the aged woman and her ghost husband. Watching this film was just surreal. You can see the ugliness of her legacy being caked over with the sympathetic tones of a trailblazer and edited to highlight only her greatest hits. A better film would not shy away from the critical aspects of her legacy. And you can feel the potential that's being wasted here. If the movie was willing to go a little longer and be a little more daring, it could have painted a more complete picture of Margaret Thatcher's political career. And it just ends up being a hollow exercise in trying to make Thatcher look good and, only gracing a few of her warts and trimmed to make her as sympathetic and powerful as possible. There's gotta be a better depiction of Margaret Thatcher in media, and, well, Thankfully, there is. Brian and Maggie is a 2-episode miniseries that centers around the televised interviews between former MP Brian Walden and Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. It stars Steve Coogan as Walden and Harriet Walter as Thatcher, and it's great. Okay, I'm exaggerating a little bit. It's not perfect. It has some problems with pacing and tends to get a little lost in the details here and there, but you know, after enduring the wasted potential of the Iron Lady, this was a breath of fresh air. You can learn more about British politics of the 1980s from Brian and Maggie than you would from the Iron Lady. Actually, let me lower that bar even further. You could learn more from the puppetry satire of Spitting Image than you could from the Iron Lady. I will give the film this. It's not as loaded with lies as the Reagan movie, nor does it try to deny Thatcher's worst attributes. But much like a polarizing jazz song, you have to listen to the notes they're not striking here. The film reveals the history of Margaret Thatcher, but not all of it, and definitely doesn't provide any firm dissection of what made her so despised to warrant the protests in the streets against her administration. There is a lot to hate about Margaret Thatcher. There's also a lot to praise her for, beyond the Falklands War victory or standing up to the boys' club of politics. But when the movie tries to cover the popular historical bullet points while presenting Thatcher as a revered figure, it ultimately comes off as a hollow story, proving little beyond Streep's ability to pull off Thatcher. No matter how many times the film portrays her as a Spitfire politician or a sad old lady, you cannot overlook all the atrocities of her political career. And it's pretty gross that the film favors doing just that.
So, if you don't dig more coal, they'll put you on the dynamite gang.
No dynamite!
There's blood on your hands, Mrs. Thatcher! Blood on your hands, Mrs. Thatcher! I didn't realize British coal miners had it so bad.
No dynamite!
Jim Broadbent. Jim Broadbent.
Son, if you don't dig more,
Jim Broadbent,
put you on the dynamite gang. There's blood on your hands, Mrs. Thatcher!